A mother's love knows no shame when her children are hungry. Behind a small-town grocery store, Evelyn Grace holds her baby close while searching through thrown-away food, her pregnant belly a reminder that soon she'll have two little lives depending on her. When Sheriff Tom Bradley finds her there, he expects silence or shame. Instead, Evelyn tells him something that breaks his heart. She once lived in this town. She had a home here, neighbors who knew her name. But betrayal changed everything, leaving her invisible to people who once called her friend. When her story spreads through the community, it turns whispers into guilt. The whole town must face a hard truth about who they've become. What secret from her past will force an entire community to choose between comfortable indifference and life-changing compassion? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn wind carried memories through Millbrook Falls like fallen leaves, stirring up fragments of what used to be. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood beside his patrol car, watching the pregnant woman disappear into the shadows behind Fletcher's grocery. Her words still echoed in his mind, each syllable heavy with a pain he couldn't quite place, yet understood in his bones. Evelyn Grace. The name felt familiar on his tongue, though he couldn't immediately recall why. At 47, Tom had spent most of his adult life in this town, following in his father's footsteps as a keeper of the peace. His father, Sheriff Marcus Bradley, had worn the badge for 32 years before passing it down like a sacred trust. A sheriff's job isn't just enforcing the law, his father had always said. It's protecting the heart of the community. Tom pulled out his phone and dialed his wife. "Sarah, I'm going to be late for dinner. Again." Sarah's voice carried the weight of 23 years of marriage, patient but tired. "The kids were hoping you'd help with homework tonight. Something came up, a situation I need to think through." "What kind of situation?" Tom watched the grocery store's back door, where Evelyn had vanished moments before. The kind that makes you question what you know about people. The truth was, Tom had been questioning a lot lately. Millbrook Falls had changed over the past a few years, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly when or how. The town still looked the same. Tree-lined streets, historic courthouse, the old mill that gave the place its name. But something essential had shifted, like a photograph slowly fading in sunlight. He drove through downtown, past the familiar landmarks of his childhood. Morrison's Hardware, where his father had bought him his first fishing tackle. The Sunrise Diner, where high school sweethearts still shared milkshakes at corner booths. The library, where Mrs. Henderson had worked for 37 years before retiring last spring. Each building held layers of memory, generations of stories written in brick and mortar. But beneath the surface, Tom sensed something rotting. It started small, whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, decisions made behind closed doors, a growing divide between those who had and those who didn't. The town council meetings had become exercises in careful language and careful omissions. Mayor Davidson, Harold Whitman, and their circle of influence seemed to be shaping policy, while the rest of the community went through the motions of democracy. Tom pulled into his driveway, a modest two-story house on Elm Street, where he'd raised his children, Jake and Melissa. At 19 and 17, they were good kids who still came home for Sunday dinners and called when they needed advice. Sarah met him at the door, her graying hair pulled back in the practical style she'd worn for years, her eyes holding questions. She didn't ask. "You look troubled," she said, taking his jacket. "A pregnant woman was going through garbage behind Fletcher's today. She told me she used to live here, that people knew her name." Sarah's expression shifted, concern replacing mild irritation. "Did you get her name?" "Evelyn Grace." The color drained from Sarah's face. She stood frozen for a moment, her hand still holding Tom's jacket. "Evelyn Grace? Are you certain?" "You know her." "Tom, she used to teach at the elementary school." "She was—" Sarah stopped, choosing her words carefully. "There was a scandal 3 years ago. She was accused of stealing money from the school fund. It was all anyone talked about for months. The pieces began clicking into place. Tom remembered. Now, fragments of conversations, newspaper headlines he'd read but not fully processed. What happened to her? She lost everything. Her job, her house, her husband left her. People said she was pregnant when it all came out. I heard she'd left town in disgrace. Sarah sat heavily on their living room couch. Tom, if she's been here all this time, living like that, with a baby and another on the way. They sat in silence, the weight of realization settling between them. Their comfortable middle-class life suddenly felt fragile, built on assumptions they'd never questioned. How does someone go from respected teacher to searching through garbage? How does a community let one of their own disappear so completely? That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He stood at his bedroom window, looking out at the quiet street where every house told a story of stability and belonging. Somewhere in the darkness, Evelyn Grace was caring for her baby in the back seat of what he'd glimpsed was an old Honda. Its paint faded and one window held together with tape. He thought about his father's words, about protecting the heart of the community. But what happened when the community lost its heart? What happened when protecting some people meant abandoning others? The next morning, Tom drove by Fletcher's grocery before his official shift began. The Honda was parked in the far corner of the lot, partially hidden behind a dumpster. Through the cracked rear window, he could see movement, a woman's silhouette, as she tended to something small and precious. Martha Reynolds, who owned Fletcher's grocery, was unlocking the front door when Tom approached. At 62, Martha had run the store for nearly 3 decades, watching generations of families grow up in her aisles. She had the practical wisdom of someone who'd seen people at their best and worst, usually over disputes about expired coupons or shoplifted candy bars. "Morning, Tom, you're out early." "Martha, there's a woman living in her car in your parking lot, pregnant with a baby." Martha's shoulders sagged slightly. "I've seen her. She's not causing trouble, not bothering customers. She buys what she can afford, and sometimes—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "Sometimes she goes through what we throw out. Food that's still good but past the sell-by date. You know who she is?" "Evelyn Grace." Martha's voice was barely above a whisper. "She used to shop here every week, brought her students by for the school fundraisers, always had a smile, always remembered to ask about my arthritis. Do you believe what they said about her? The theft?" Martha looked away, focusing on something in the distance. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Tom, but I know what I see. And what I see is a young woman who's been carrying more than any person should have to carry." Tom spent his morning patrol thinking about carrying. Everyone in Millbrook Falls carried something: hopes, disappointments, secrets, shame. But most people had places to set their burdens down, at least temporarily. Evelyn Grace seemed to be carrying everything with no place to rest. He remembered her from before, now that Sarah had jogged his memory. She'd been at community events, teacher, conferences, the kind of person who volunteered for committees and remembered everyone's children's names. She'd had an easy laugh and bright eyes, the sort of person who made others feel comfortable in their own skin. The woman he'd met yesterday still had strength, but it was a different kind, the fierce, protective strength of someone who'd been stripped down to essentials and discovered what truly mattered. Her dignity hadn't been stolen along with everything else. If anything, it had been refined, purified by suffering into something more valuable than mere respectability. Tom's radio crackled with routine calls. A fender bender on Main Street, a complaint about barking dogs, a minor break-in at the hardware store. Normal problems that normal people solved with insurance claims and strongly worded letters. But underneath the routine business of small-town law enforcement, he found himself thinking about different kinds of justice, different kinds of protection. When he drove past Fletcher's again that afternoon, the Honda was gone. For a moment, he felt relief. Perhaps Evelyn had found somewhere better to go, someone to help her. But as the day wore on, the feeling transformed into something more troubling. What if she'd simply moved her suffering somewhere less visible? What if the town's response to poverty was to ensure it happened out of sight? That evening, Tom found himself driving the back streets and rural roads around Millbrook Falls, looking for a faded Honda with a brave woman and her children inside. He told himself it was professional concern, part of his duty to know what was happening in his jurisdiction, but honestly, it was more personal than that. He found them parked behind the old Methodist church on the edge of town, under the protective canopy of an ancient oak tree. The church had been abandoned for 5 years, since the congregation merged with the larger Baptist church downtown. It was the kind of place someone might park without being noticed, at least until the weather turned cold. Tom sat in his patrol car for a long time, watching the gentle movement in the Honda's back seat. A baby's cry carried on the evening air, quickly soothed by a mother's voice humming something soft and familiar. He thought about his own children, about the safety and security he'd been able to provide them, about the difference between earning comfort and simply being born into it. When he finally drove home, Sarah was waiting with questions he wasn't ready to answer and concerns that mirrored his own growing unease about the community they'd helped build and sustain. The truth was, Tom Bradley was beginning to suspect that Millbrook Falls had lost something essential, something his father had spent 32 years protecting. And if he was right, if the heart of the community had indeed gone missing, then finding it again would require more than good intentions and careful police work. It would require the kind of courage his father had always said was the most important part of wearing the badge. The courage to do what was right even when it wasn't easy, even when it meant questioning everything you thought you knew about the people and place you'd sworn to serve. Tom found Evelyn the next morning behind the Methodist church, sitting on the ground beside her car, while her baby played with a worn teddy bear in the grass. The sight of them in the early light, mother and child making the best of an impossible situation, struck him with unexpected force. "Ma'am," he said, approaching slowly, "I'd like to talk, if you don't mind." Evelyn looked up, shielding her, eyes from the morning sun. Up close, Tom could see the exhaustion etched in her features, but also something else. A quiet determination that spoke of reserves he couldn't fathom. "About moving along?" she asked. "I understand. We'll pack up." "No," Tom said, surprising himself. "About what really happened to you." For a long moment, Evelyn studied his face. The baby, Emma, he remembered, babbled happily, oblivious to the weight of adult conversation. Finally, Evelyn gestured to the church steps. "It's a long story, Sheriff Bradley. I've got time." They sat in the shadow of the abandoned church while Evelyn told him everything. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, as if she'd rehearsed the facts so many times they'd lost their power to wound her. But Tom caught the subtle tremors, the places where her breathing changed, the way her hand instinctively moved to protect her unborn child. 3 years ago, Evelyn Grace had been living what most people would consider a good life. She taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary, owned a small house on Maple Street, and was married to David Grace, who worked as an accountant for several local businesses. They'd been trying to have children for years, and when Evelyn finally became pregnant, it felt like all the pieces of their life were falling into place. Then, the school district's annual audit revealed a discrepancy. $23,000 missing from the fundraising account that Evelyn managed as part of her duties. The money had been raised through bake sales, car washes, and community donations to buy new computers for the children, they called. "Me in on a Tuesday morning," Evelyn said, watching Emma chase dandelion seeds in the breeze. Principal Morrison, the superintendent, Harold Whitman from the school board. They had printouts, bank statements, all very official. They said the money had been transferred to an account with my name on it, an account you didn't open. I'd never seen it before in my life. But there was my signature, or something that looked like it. The transfers happened over several months, small amounts each time. Clever, really. Not enough to trigger automatic flags, but it added up. Tom leaned forward. "What did your husband say?" Evelyn's composure cracked slightly. "David believed them. He said he'd noticed me being secretive about money, staying late at school more often. He said it explained why I'd been so stressed about the pregnancy. She paused, collecting herself. When you've been with someone for 8 years and they look at you like you're a stranger, like you're capable of stealing from children, something breaks that can't be fixed. The investigation was swift and thorough, or at least it appeared to be. The district's auditor, a firm hired by Harold Whitman, found additional irregularities. Money that had gone missing from previous years, patterns that suggested systematic theft. Evelyn was suspended immediately, pending criminal charges. The worst part wasn't the accusations, she continued. It was watching people I'd worked with. For 6 years, just accept it. Colleagues who'd eaten lunch with me every day suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Parents who'd hugged me at school events crossed the street to avoid me. It was like I'd become invisible overnight. David filed for divorce before the criminal investigation was complete. He moved out of their house, taking most of their savings to pay for lawyers and start over. Evelyn, 7 months pregnant and unable to work, watched her life disintegrate. Piece by piece, the district attorney eventually dropped the charges, she said. Not enough evidence for conviction, they said, but by then it didn't matter. The damage was done. No school would hire me. David was gone. The bank foreclosed on the house. I had Emma in the charity ward at the county hospital, and when we were discharged, we had nowhere to go. Tom felt something cold settling in his stomach. Who found the missing money? Who traced it to you? Harold Whitman's accounting firm. Same company that does the books for most of the big businesses in town. They're very thorough, apparently. Harold Whitman. Tom knew the name well. One of Millbrook Falls' most prominent citizens, owner of 3 auto dealerships and half a dozen rental properties. Harold served on the school board, the town council, and the Chamber of Commerce. He was the kind of man who got things done, who knew how to work the system for the good of the community. Or at least that's what Tom had always assumed. Evelyn, did you ever see the original bank records, the actual documents that showed the transfers? I wasn't allowed to. My lawyer said they were part of the investigation, that we'd get access during discovery if it went to trial. But when the charges were dropped, the evidence disappeared. My lawyer said there was no point pursuing it, that I should be grateful. The district attorney didn't prosecute, that trying to clear my name would just bring more attention to something everyone wanted to forget. Tom watched Emma toddle toward her mother, clutching the teddy bear. The toy was obviously loved, its fur worn smooth in places where small hands had held it tight. Probably one of the few possessions that had survived Evelyn's fall from grace. Where have you been living since then? Shelters, when they had space. Friends' couches until the friends ran out. The car mostly. David sends $50 a month through his lawyer. Child support, technically, though it doesn't go very far. And now you're pregnant again. Evelyn's hand moved to her belly, a gesture that was protective and proud at the same time. Some people would say it was irresponsible, bringing another child into this situation. But Emma and this baby, they're the reason I keep going. They deserve better than this, and I'm going to find a way to give it to them. The conviction in her voice struck Tom like a physical blow. Here was a woman who'd lost everything: home, career, husband, reputation, financial, security, and still believed in tomorrow. Still fought for something better, still maintained her dignity in circumstances that would have broken most people. Evelyn, I want to help you. Why? The question wasn't defensive, just curious. You don't know me. For all you know, everything they said about me is true. Tom considered this. 3 days ago, he might have believed the official story without question. Respected citizens like Harold Whitman didn't falsely accuse innocent teachers. The system worked. Justice was served. Good people prospered, and bad people faced consequences. But sitting here beside this abandoned church, watching a pregnant woman tend to her child with infinite gentleness, despite having every reason to be bitter, Tom realized how naive those assumptions were. Because, he said slowly, I've spent 23 years as a sheriff, and I know the difference between someone who's guilty and someone who's been railroaded. And because my father always told me that a badge doesn't make you a good man, it just gives you the chance to prove whether you already were one. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, and Tom saw something in her eyes he hadn't noticed before. Hope, fragile and carefully guarded, but unmistakably real. What are you saying, Sheriff? I'm saying that maybe it's time someone took a closer look at what really happened 3 years ago. I'm saying that maybe the people of Millbrook Falls deserve to know the truth about who they've been protecting and who they've been abandoning. Emma stumbled and fell, letting out a cry that brought Evelyn instantly to her feet. As she comforted her daughter, whispering reassurances and checking for scrapes, Tom made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find out what really happened to Evelyn Grace, and if she'd been framed, if the people he'd trusted to lead his community had destroyed an innocent woman to cover their own crimes. Then he was going to make sure the truth came to light, even if it cost him everything. Tom Bradley drove home that evening with his father's sheriff badge burning like a coal in his chest pocket. He'd carried it every day since his father's funeral 5 years ago. Not the official badge he wore on his uniform, but the original one his father had worn for 3 decades. It was scratched and tarnished, worn smooth at the edges, where his father's thumb had rubbed it during moments of deep thought. A badge is more than metal, his father had told him during his final days in the hospital. It's a promise to something bigger than yourself. Sometimes that promise is easy to keep. Sometimes it costs you everything you thought you wanted. Sarah was waiting in the kitchen, her expression unreadable as she watched him hang his gun belt on the hook by the door. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read his moods like weather patterns, and tonight's storm was clearly visible. "You're going to help her," she said. "It wasn't a question. I have to." "Why?" "Tom, we have our own family to think about, our own future." He sat across from her at the kitchen table, where they'd shared thousands of meals, planned vacations, helped their children with homework. The familiar comfort of home felt different now, precious but fragile, like something that could disappear if he made the wrong choice. Because if we don't help her, who will? Because if good people don't stand up when they see injustice, then we're not really good people at all. Sarah's shoulders sagged. "And if you're wrong, if she really did steal that money, then I'll accept the consequences. But Sarah, I've looked into her eyes. I've seen how she cares for that baby. Whatever else she might be, she's not a thief who steals from children." That night, Tom lay awake, staring at the ceiling, planning his investigation. He'd need to be careful. Harold Whitman had influence throughout the county, and accusations without proof would end Tom's career and accomplish nothing for Evelyn. But somewhere in the files and records of 3 years ago, the truth was waiting. City. Next morning he started with the school district's records. Principal Morrison, now retired, had been replaced by Linda Chen, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who'd transferred from the state capital to bring fresh energy to Millbrook Elementary. "Sheriff Bradley," she greeted him in her office, surrounded by boxes of files she was still organizing. "What can I do for you? I'm looking into some old cases, trying to tie up loose ends. The Evelyn Grace situation from 3 years ago. Do you have the records?" Linda's expression grew cautious. "That was before my time, but I've heard about it. May I ask why you're interested?" Tom had prepared for this question. "Mrs. Grace has surfaced again, and there are some procedural issues I need to clarify for my reports." It wasn't technically a lie, though it wasn't the whole truth either. Linda studied him for a moment, then pulled a thick file from one of her boxes. "Everything's here," she said. "The audit results, the investigation notes, the board meetings. It's actually quite thorough." She paused. "Sheriff, may I speak frankly? Please. I've taught for 15 years, worked in 4 different districts. I've seen teachers who cut corners, who play favorites, who phone it in for their last few years before retirement. But the kind of systematic theft they accused Evelyn Grace of, it leaves traces. Behavioral changes, lifestyle upgrades, some sign that someone's living beyond their means. And, from everything I can see in these files, there were no signs. Her classroom was exemplary. Her students adored her. She lived modestly, drove an old car, bought generic groceries. If she was stealing thousands of dollars, she was hiding it better than most FBI agents could manage. Tom felt his suspicions crystallizing into certainty. Who conducted the initial audit? Whitman and Associates. Harold Whitman's accounting. A firm. They handle most of the district's financial work. And who hired them for this particular audit? Linda flipped through the papers. The school board voted to conduct an emergency audit after some concerns were raised about fundraising discrepancies. The motion was made by... She stopped, her finger on the page. Harold Whitman himself. Tom felt pieces clicking into place. Like tumblers in a lock, Harold Whitman's firm discovers money missing from an account managed by Evelyn Grace. Harold Whitman leads the investigation into Evelyn Grace. Harold Whitman's evidence destroys Evelyn Grace's life. Ms. Chen, I'd like to make copies of these files. Of course, but Sheriff, be careful. Harold Whitman is a powerful man in this county. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, make sure you have all your facts straight before you make any moves. Tom spent the afternoon in his office, spreading the files across his desk like a puzzle he was determined to solve. The paper trail was impressive. Bank statements, transfer records, signature comparisons, everything pointed clearly to Evelyn's guilt. Too clearly, perhaps. His phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "How's the investigation going?" He stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Just getting started." Meanwhile, across town, Evelyn was discovering that even trying to find work while homeless was nearly impossible. She'd spent the morning walking Main Street, checking with businesses that might need part-time help. Her teaching credentials were worthless now, but she could clean, she could sort inventory, she could answer phones. At Peterson's drugstore, the manager looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grace, but we're not hiring right now." "The sign in your window says you are." "Well, yes, but..." He couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry." Martha Reynolds at Fletcher's Grocery was more direct. "Evelyn, honey, I'd hire you in a heartbeat if I could, but word gets around in a small town, people are still talking about what happened. If I hired you, some folks might stop shopping here." "I understand," Evelyn said, though understanding didn't make it hurt less. She spent her lunch hour in the park, sharing a peanut butter sandwich with Emma, while trying to figure out their next move. Her pregnancy was advancing, and soon she'd need medical care she couldn't afford. The Honda was making troubling noises, and winter was only a few months away. A shadow fell across their picnic blanket. Claire Morrison, Evelyn's former teaching partner and closest friend, stood awkwardly nearby. "Hello, Evelyn." "Claire." Evelyn's voice was neutral, carefully controlled. "I heard you were back in town. I wasn't sure if..." Claire sat down, uninvited. Her eyes fixed on Emma, who was now 2 years old and chattering happily to her teddy bear. "She's beautiful. She looks like you." "Thank you." They sat in silence for several minutes. Claire had been the maid of honor at Evelyn's wedding, the first person she'd called when she found out she was pregnant. They'd planned lessons together, shared books and dreams and late-night phone calls about their students. Claire's betrayal, her silent acceptance of Evelyn's guilt, had hurt almost as much as David's abandonment. "Evelyn, I need you to know that I never believed..." Claire started again. "That is, I always wondered. If you wondered, why didn't you speak up?" "Because I was scared," Claire admitted. "Scared of losing my job, scared of being wrong, scared of making things worse for you. I told myself that staying quiet was the safe choice, that it wasn't my place to get involved." And now, Claire looked around the park, at the playground where they'd once brought their classes for end-of-year celebrations. "Now I think safety is overrated when it comes at the cost of doing what's right." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was the closest thing to one Evelyn had received in 3 years. She felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of anger and hurt that she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. "Claire, if you really want to help, if you really want to make things right, then help me find the truth. Help me prove what really happened." Claire met her eyes for the first time since sitting down. "How? I don't know yet. But Sheriff Bradley seems to think there might be a way." As they talked, Tom was finishing his review of the files, and a pattern was emerging that made his blood run cold. If his suspicions were correct, Evelyn Grace wasn't just the victim of a crime. She was the victim of a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of Millbrook Falls' power structure. And Tom Bradley was about to find out just how dangerous it could be to threaten that structure, even in the name of justice. Tom's breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a late-night conversation with Jerry Hansen, the school district's IT coordinator who'd been quietly drinking alone at Murphy's Tavern. Jerry was a nervous, thin man who'd always seemed to prefer computers to people, and after 3 beers, he was more talkative than usual. "Sheriff Bradley," Jerry said, sliding into the booth across from Tom. "Mind if I join you?" Tom had come to Murphy's, hoping to think through his investigation in peace, but something in Jerry's manner suggested this wasn't a casual encounter. "Have a seat. I heard you've been asking questions about the old school records. The Evelyn Grace thing. Word travels fast." Jerry glanced around the dimly lit tavern, then leaned forward. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have said 3 years ago." Tom set down his beer, giving Jerry his full attention. "When they did that audit, when they found the missing money, I was the one who pulled all the computer records. Bank transfers, email logs, all the digital evidence." Jerry's hands shook slightly as he reached for his drink. "Sheriff, those records were clean when I first pulled them." "What do you mean, clean?" "I mean there was no evidence of any unauthorized transfers from Evelyn's account. The fundraising money was exactly where it should have been. I ran the reports 3 times because I couldn't understand what the fuss was about." Tom felt his pulse quicken. "What happened next?" "Harold Whitman called me into his office the next day, said there must have been some mistake, that his firm had already found clear evidence of the theft. He asked me to run the reports again, but this time using different parameters, looking at archived data from the backup servers instead of the live system. And the archived data told a completely different story, showed transfers happening over several months, all traced back to Evelyn's login credentials." Jerry finished his beer in one gulp. "Sheriff, I've been working with computer systems for 15 years. I know the difference between data that's been there all along and data that's been inserted after the fact." Tom's mouth went dry. "You're saying the evidence was planted?" "I'm saying someone with serious technical skills and administrative access created a digital paper trail that would stand up in court, and I'm saying Harold Whitman knew exactly what to look for and where to find it. Why didn't you speak up?" Jerry's laugh was bitter. "Because I like my job, Sheriff. Because I have a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage. Because when Harold Whitman suggested that questioning the evidence would only hurt Evelyn more, that it would drag out a painful process and make her look guilty in the court of public opinion, it seemed easier to stay quiet." Tom studied the man across from him, seeing the weight of 3 years' worth of guilt written in every line of his face. "Jerry, would you be willing to testify to this? To go on record? If it would help Evelyn, yes. But Sheriff, be careful who you trust with this information. Harold Whitman has a lot of friends in this county, a lot of people who owe him favors." The next morning, Tom drove to the elementary school with a specific mission. He needed to see the computer system that Jerry had described, and he needed to do it without alerting anyone to his investigation. Fortunately, Linda Chen was cooperative when he explained he was conducting a security review. "Of course," she said, leading him to the technology office. "Jerry Hansen can show you anything you need to see." But Jerry wasn't there. According to the secretary, he'd called in sick, the first sick day he'd taken in over 2 years. Tom felt a chill of apprehension. Had someone warned Jerry to stay away? Or was Jerry having second thoughts about his late-night confession? Tom spent an hour examining the school's computer system, taking careful notes about access logs and backup procedures. What he found confirmed Jerry's story. The system was sophisticated enough to support the kind of digital manipulation Jerry had described, and administrative access would have allowed someone to plant evidence in the archived records. Meanwhile, Evelyn was facing a crisis of her own. She'd awakened that morning to find 3 men standing beside her car in the church parking lot. They weren't locals. Their clothes were too expensive, their manner too professional. One of them tapped on her window. "Mrs. Grace, we'd like to have a word with you." Evelyn clutched Emma closer, her heart racing. "Who are you?" "Representatives of certain business interests in town. We understand you've been talking to people, stirring up old memories about past misunderstandings." "I haven't talked to anyone except Sheriff Bradley." "That's the problem," the man said. His voice was calm, reasonable, the tone someone might use to discuss the weather. "Sheriff Bradley is a good man, but he sometimes gets ideas that aren't in anyone's best interest, including yours. What do you want?" "We want to help you, Mrs. Grace. Help you and your children get a fresh start somewhere new. We're prepared to offer you $5,000 and assistance relocating to another state, somewhere you can begin again without the burden of past misunderstandings following you." Evelyn stared at them through the car window, understanding perfectly what was being offered and what was being threatened. "And if I don't want to leave, then you'll continue living exactly as you are now, in your car, searching through garbage, watching your children suffer. And Sheriff Bradley will continue asking questions that make people uncomfortable until someone decides he's become more trouble than he's worth." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Evelyn felt Emma stirring in her lap, beginning to wake up. Whatever choice she made would affect not just her own future, but the future of her children and possibly Tom Bradley's family as well. "I need time to think about it." "Of course. Take all the time you need. But understand that this offer has an expiration date. And Mrs. Grace," the man's smile was cold and practiced, "accidents happen to people who don't know when to accept help." They walked away without another word, leaving Evelyn alone with her racing heart and a decision that could determine whether justice would ever be served or whether the truth would be buried permanently beneath a mountain of money and threats. That afternoon, Tom found himself face to face with Harold Whitman at the county courthouse. Whitman was exactly what Tom had expected. Tall, silver-haired, expensively dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from years of getting his way. He greeted Tom with a firm handshake and a politician's smile. "Sheriff Bradley, I understand. You've been reviewing some of our old school district work. Quality control, I assume." "Something like that," Tom replied carefully. "Well, I'm glad to see local law enforcement taking such a thorough approach. Though I have to say, that Evelyn Grace situation was unfortunate all around. Terrible thing when someone you trust betrays that trust, especially when children are involved." Tom studied Whitman's face, looking for tells, for any sign of guilt or nervousness. He found neither. Harold Whitman was either genuinely innocent or an accomplished liar. "Did you know Mrs. Grace personally before the investigation?" "Oh, certainly. Small town, you know. Everyone knows everyone. She seemed like a dedicated teacher, which made the whole thing that much more shocking." Whitman's expression grew somber. "I heard she's back in town. I hope she's found some way to make amends and move forward with her life. She's living in her car with her baby." For just a moment, so briefly Tom almost missed it, something flickered across Whitman's face. Surprise, guilt, satisfaction. It was gone too quickly to interpret. "How unfortunate," Whitman said, "though I suppose the consequences of our choices have a way of following us." Tom left the courthouse with more questions than answers, but with one certainty: Harold Whitman was hiding something. The man's reaction to learning about Evelyn's circumstances had been too controlled, too carefully neutral. An innocent person would have shown more surprise or concern. Sarah was waiting when Tom got home, her face pale with worry. "Tom, we need to talk." "What's wrong?" I got a call today, anonymous. Someone said you were asking questions that could be dangerous for our family. They suggested you might want to focus on your official duties and leave the past alone. Tom felt the walls closing in. First Jerry's sick day, then the mysterious men visiting Evelyn, now threats directed at his own family. Someone was monitoring his investigation, and that someone had resources and connections. Sarah, I'm not going to be intimidated into abandoning an innocent woman. How do you know she's innocent? Tom, what if you're wrong? What if you're risking everything for someone who really did steal that money? It was a fair question, one that Tom had asked himself repeatedly. But as he thought about Evelyn Grace, about her dignity in the face of poverty, her fierce protection of her children, her willingness to face the truth no matter how painful, he knew his answer. Because I've looked into her eyes, Sarah. Because I've seen how she loves that baby. Because everything about this case stinks of a setup. And because my father taught me that sometimes doing the right thing costs more than you want to pay. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small USB drive. What's this? I stopped by the school today to volunteer in Jake's old classroom. Linda Chen mentioned you'd been looking at computer records, so I asked Jerry Hansen if there was anything else you might need to see. Sarah's voice was steady, but Tom could see the fear in her eyes. He gave me this and asked me to tell you it contains the original data, the records from before they were altered. He said to tell you he's leaving town tonight, but he wanted to make sure the truth survived, even if he didn't. Tom stared at the USB drive, understanding that he was holding either the key to Evelyn's vindication or the instrument of his own destruction. Once he looked at what was on this drive, there would be no going back. The investigation would move. From speculation to concrete evidence, and the people who had framed Evelyn Grace would have to decide whether Tom Bradley was a problem they could ignore or a threat they needed to eliminate. Sarah, I want you to take the kids and visit your sister in Springfield for a few days. Tom, please, until I know how dangerous this is going to get, I need to know you're safe. As night fell over Millbrook Falls, Tom sat alone in his study, staring at the USB drive and thinking about courage, justice, and the price of doing what was right. Outside, the town looked peaceful and normal, but he knew that underneath the surface, forces were gathering that would test everything he believed about law, order, and the community he'd sworn to protect. The truth was waiting on that USB drive. The question was whether Tom Bradley was brave enough to face it and strong enough to survive the consequences of bringing it to light. Tom waited until 3 in the morning to examine the USB drive, when the house was silent and the street outside lay empty under the pale glow of streetlights. His hands shook slightly as he inserted the drive into his laptop, knowing that whatever he found would change everything. The files loaded slowly, revealing months of financial records, email logs, and transaction data from the school district's computer system. Tom spent 2 hours going through everything, cross-referencing dates and amounts, building a timeline that made his blood run cold. The evidence was devastating and undeniable. The original record showed exactly what Jerry had described. No unauthorized transfers, no missing money, no evidence of theft. But more than that, the files revealed the sophisticated nature of the frame-up. Someone had created false transaction records, forged digital signatures, and even planted emails in Evelyn's account that appeared to show her coordinating the thefts. But the most damning evidence was in the metadata, the hidden information that showed when files were created and modified. According to the timestamps, the fabricated evidence had all been created on the same day, 2 weeks after Evelyn had been suspended. Someone had spent hours crafting a digital crime scene that would destroy her life. And according to the access logs, that someone had used Harold Whitman's administrative credentials to do it. Tom printed everything, making multiple copies that he hid in different locations. Then he sat back in his chair, staring at the evidence spread across his desk, and tried to comprehend the scope of what he'd uncovered. This wasn't just a case of embezzlement or even false accusation. This was a deliberate conspiracy to destroy an innocent woman, carried out by people with the technical skills and administrative access to make it look completely legitimate. But why? Why target Evelyn Grace specifically? What had she done to warrant such elaborate destruction? The answer came to him as dawn broke over Millbrook Falls. Evelyn hadn't been the target. She'd been the fall guy. Someone else had been stealing from the school district, and when an audit threatened to expose them, they'd needed a scapegoat. Evelyn, with her access to the fundraising account and her trusting nature, had been perfect for the role. The question now was how to prove it without getting himself and his family killed in the process. Meanwhile, Evelyn was facing her own moment of reckoning. The men's threat had kept her awake all night, and as she watched Emma sleep in the back seat of the Honda, she struggled with an impossible choice. Take the money and run, ensuring her children's immediate safety but abandoning any hope of clearing her name, or stay and fight, risking not just her own life but the lives of her children and anyone who tried to help her. At sunrise, she made her decision. She drove to the one place in Millbrook Falls where she'd always found peace, the small cemetery behind the Methodist church where her father was buried. Robert Hayes had been a high school principal for 37 years, a man who'd built his life on the principle that truth always mattered more than convenience. Standing beside his headstone, holding Emma in her arms, Evelyn spoke to him as if he were still alive. "Dad, I don't know what to do. They're offering me a way out, but it means running away and never fighting for the truth. It means letting whoever did this get away with destroying my life." She paused, feeling the baby kick inside her. "But if I stay and fight, I might be putting Emma and the new baby in danger. What would you do?" The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, Evelyn could almost hear her father's voice. "The truth is like sunlight, honey. It might hurt your eyes at first, but it's the only thing that really makes you free." That afternoon, Evelyn sought out Tom at the sheriff's station. She found him in his office, looking haggard and troubled, surrounded by papers and files. "Sheriff Bradley, we need to talk." Tom looked up, surprised to see her. "Mrs. Grace, what are you doing here? It's not safe for you to—" They came to. "See me yesterday. 3 men. They offered me money to leave town and never come back." Tom's expression darkened. "Did they threaten you?" "Not directly. But the message was clear. Take the money and disappear or face the consequences." Evelyn sat down across from his desk, Emma quiet in her lap. "I wanted you to know that I'm not taking their offer. Evelyn, maybe you should consider—" "No." Her voice was firm, brooking no argument. "My father always taught me that running away from the truth only gives it more power over you. These people destroyed my life once. I won't let them do it again." Tom studied her face, seeing the same quiet determination that had impressed him from their first meeting. Here was a woman who'd lost everything but refused to lose her integrity. "I found something," he said finally. "Evidence that proves you were framed." Hope flickered in Evelyn's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "What kind of evidence?" Tom showed her the printed files, explaining what Jerry had revealed and what the computer records proved. As he talked, Evelyn's composure began to crack. 3 years of carrying the weight of false accusations, 3 years of believing that maybe some people would always think she was guilty, 3 years of wondering if she'd somehow brought the destruction on herself. "You mean it's really over?" she whispered. "People will know I didn't steal that money." "It's not over yet," Tom said gently. "Having the evidence and getting justice are 2 different things. Harold Whitman is a powerful man with powerful friends. Exposing him is going to require careful planning and probably some help from outside the county. What do you need me to do?" "Right now, I need you to stay safe. These people have already shown they're willing to threaten you and your children. They won't hesitate to escalate if they think you're about to expose them." As if summoned by their conversation, Tom's phone rang. The caller ID showed Harold Whitman's office number. "Sheriff Bradley," Tom answered, keeping his voice neutral. Tom, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. I understand there's been some concern about security at the school district's computer system. Some talk about old files being accessed inappropriately. The message was clear. Whitman knew about the USB drive and was warning Tom to back off. I'm not sure what you mean, Mr. Whitman. Oh, I think you do. Tom, you've always been a reasonable man. I hope you'll continue to be reasonable, especially when it comes to protecting your family's well-being. The line went dead, leaving Tom staring at the phone with a mixture of anger and fear. Whitman wasn't even bothering to hide his threats anymore. The investigation had reached a tipping point where subtlety was being abandoned in favor of direct intimidation. What did he say? Evelyn asked. Enough to convince me that we're running out of time. If we're going to do this, we need to move fast. Tom stood up, his mind racing through possibilities. Evelyn, do you trust me with my life? Then I need you to do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, no matter how dangerous it might seem, because the only way we're going to get justice is if we're willing to risk everything to get it. Outside the sheriff's station, Harold Whitman sat in his luxury sedan, watching through tinted windows as Evelyn Grace emerged with her baby. His phone buzzed with a text message. She didn't take the offer. What now? Whitman typed back. Now we remind everyone in this town what happens to people who don't know when to accept help. The war for Evelyn Grace's vindication was about to begin in earnest, and both sides understood that only one would survive it. The attack on Evelyn came 3 days later, subtle and devastating in its cruelty. She'd been managing to get by on the kindness of a few townspeople. Martha Reynolds occasionally left expired but edible food where Evelyn could find it, and Dr. Susan Walsh at the community clinic had been providing prenatal care despite Evelyn's inability to pay. But suddenly, those small lifelines began disappearing. Martha called Evelyn aside when she came to the grocery store. Honey, I'm sorry, but I can't help you anymore. Someone complained to the health department about my disposal practices. They're threatening to shut me down if I don't follow regulations to the letter. Dr. Walsh was more direct when Evelyn arrived for her appointment. Evelyn, I've been ordered by the clinic's board to discontinue your care unless you can pay in advance. I fought it, but they say it's a liability issue. Who's on the clinic's board? Evelyn asked, though she already suspected the answer. Harold Whitman chairs it. I'm sorry, Evelyn. I really am. The systematic isolation was taking its toll, but the breaking point came when Evelyn discovered a note tucked under her car's windshield. Wiper. Some people never learn when they're not wanted. Maybe it's time your children learned what happens to families that don't know their place. The threat against Emma and her unborn child sent Evelyn into a panic that lasted through the night. She found herself drafting a letter, a suicide note. Though she couldn't quite admit that's what it was, the words poured out of her in a stream of despair and exhaustion. I can't protect them, she wrote. I can't give them the life they deserve. Maybe they'd be better off without me. Maybe David would take Emma if I wasn't in the picture anymore. Maybe the new baby would be better off not being born into this mess. She sat in her car until dawn, holding the letter and staring at the bottle of sleeping pills she'd been saving. Originally intended for the chronic insomnia that came with living in constant fear, but now representing something else entirely. Emma woke up as the sun rose, stretching and smiling at her mother with the unconscious trust that children give to the people who love them. Mama, she said, reaching for Evelyn's face with small, warm hands. In that moment, looking into her daughter's eyes, Evelyn understood that giving up wasn't an option. These children needed her, not a perfect mother with a perfect life, but her, their protector, their fighter, their source of love in a world that had shown them precious little kindness. She tore up the letter and threw the sleeping pills into a trash can. Then she drove to the sheriff's station to tell Tom that she was ready to fight back. Tom, meanwhile, was discovering just how deep the corruption in Millbrook Falls really went. His investigation into Harold Whitman had revealed a network of financial relationships that touched nearly every major business and institution in the county. Whitman's accounting firm didn't just audit the school district, it handled the books for the hospital, the courthouse, 3 banks, and dozens of private businesses. More troubling, Tom's requests for assistance from the state attorney general's office had been met with polite deferrals and bureaucratic delays. When he pressed for answers, he was told that Harold Whitman was a major contributor to the governor's campaign and that any investigation would need to be handled with appropriate sensitivity. The message was clear. Tom was on his own. But he wasn't entirely alone. Sarah had returned from her sister's house with a surprising announcement. "I've been thinking," she said as they sat at their kitchen table. The USB drive's evidence spread between them. "About what your father used to say, about protecting the heart of the community." "Sarah, I don't want you involved in this. It's too dangerous. I'm already involved. We all are. Because if we let Harold Whitman destroy Evelyn Grace and get away with it, what kind of community are we protecting?" Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "I've been talking to some of the other women in town, quietly, carefully, and I think you'd be surprised how many people have questions about what really happened 3 years ago." Sarah had been busy during her time away, making phone calls and having careful conversations with women she'd known for years. What she'd discovered was a network of quiet doubts and suppressed concerns about the Evelyn Grace case. Helen Fitzgerald remembers seeing Evelyn at the food bank right before the scandal broke, looking embarrassed but desperate. She said it didn't make sense for someone who was stealing money to be asking for help feeding her family. Nancy Rodriguez from the PTA said she always wondered why Evelyn never fought the charges harder. She said innocent people usually scream and shout and demand lawyers. Evelyn just seemed broken, like she couldn't understand what was happening to her. And Margaret Chen, Linda's aunt, said she worked with Harold Whitman's firm on some consulting projects. She said they were brilliant with computers, could make financial records say whatever they wanted them to say. Tom listened as Sarah outlined a growing coalition of women who were willing to quietly support Evelyn, though none were yet ready to go public with their doubts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "There's something else," Sarah continued. "I tracked down Jerry Hansen. He didn't leave town. He's staying with his brother in the next county. He's scared, Tom, but he's willing to testify if you can guarantee his safety." That evening, Tom met with Jerry at a diner 30 miles outside Millbrook Falls. The IT coordinator looked like he'd aged years in the past week, his nervousness making him appear older than his 42 years. "Sheriff, I want to help, but I need to know you can protect my family. Harold Whitman has connections everywhere. If I testify against him and something happens to my wife or kids, Jerry, I can't guarantee anything except that I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe. But what I can tell you is that if we don't stop this now, if we let Whitman get away with what he did to Evelyn, then none of us are really safe. He'll know he can destroy anyone who gets in his way." Jerry was quiet for a long time, stirring his coffee and staring out the diner window at the dark highway. Finally, he looked up. "What do you need me to do?" The plan they developed was risky but necessary. Jerry would return to work as if nothing had happened, but he would secretly document everything he could find about the computer system's security vulnerabilities and administrative access. Tom would continue gathering evidence while building a coalition of supporters, and Evelyn would stay visible in town, forcing people to confront the reality of what their silence had cost. "There's one more thing," Tom said as they prepared to leave. "I think we're going to need help from outside the county. Someone with the authority to investigate corruption at this level. Do you have someone in mind?" "Maybe. There's a federal prosecutor I knew in the Army, someone who specializes in public corruption cases. If I can convince her that this is worth her attention." "Do it," Jerry said, "because, Sheriff, I've got a feeling we're running out of time." As they left the diner, none of them noticed the car that had been following Tom from Millbrook Falls, or the long lens camera that had photographed their meeting. Harold Whitman's network was more extensive than any of them realized, and their every move was being watched and reported. The final phase of the conflict was about to begin, and Whitman was preparing to play his most dangerous card yet. The revelation came from the most unexpected source. Evelyn's father's final gift to her, hidden for 3 years in a place she'd never thought to look. Tom had arranged to meet Evelyn at the cemetery where she often visited her father's grave, thinking the public location would provide some safety from Whitman's surveillance. He found her sitting on the ground beside the headstone, Emma playing nearby with dandelions, the peaceful scene at odds with the gravity of their situation. "I've been coming here every week since I moved back," Evelyn said without looking up. Talking to him, asking for guidance. Sometimes I feel like he's trying to tell me something, but I can't quite hear it. Tom was about to respond when Emma toddled over to a small metal box, partially buried beneath the headstone's base. She began tugging at it with the determination that only 2-year-olds possess. "Emma, don't touch that," Evelyn said, moving to stop her daughter. But Tom was already kneeling beside the little girl, his pulse quickening as he recognized what she'd found. "Evelyn, this isn't just any box. Look at the inscription. Etched into the metal were the words, 'For Evelyn, when.' You need the truth." The box was secured with a combination lock, but Evelyn knew immediately what the numbers would be. Her birthday, the date her father had always said was the happiest day of his life. Inside, wrapped in waterproof plastic, was a small digital recording device and a letter in her father's handwriting. Evelyn's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, recognizing his careful script. "My dearest daughter," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and you've been blamed for crimes you didn't commit. I pray you never have to open this box, but if you do, know that your old father was smarter than the people who destroyed your life gave him credit for." Tom and Evelyn exchanged glances before she continued reading. 3 months before my death, Harold Whitman approached me about conducting a special audit of the school district's finances. He said there were irregularities that needed to be investigated quietly before they became public scandals. He hired me as an independent consultant, probably thinking that a retired principal wouldn't understand the sophisticated financial manipulations he was planning. Evelyn looked up from the letter, her eyes wide. "Dad was investigating the school's finances." "Keep reading," Tom urged. "What Harold didn't know was that I'd spent 37 years watching people lie to me about everything from plagiarized homework to embezzled fundraising money. I knew the signs, and I knew Harold Whitman was lying about something important. So I did what any good principal does when he suspects a student of cheating. I gathered evidence." Evelyn's hands were trembling now as she read the final paragraphs. The recording device contains 3 hours of conversations between Harold Whitman and Mayor Davidson, recorded in Whitman's office during what they thought were private meetings. They discussed stealing over $200,000 from various school accounts, and more importantly, they discussed framing an innocent teacher to cover their tracks. "They mention you by name, Evelyn. They chose you specifically because you were pregnant, vulnerable, and unlikely to fight back effectively." Tom felt cold fury building in his chest. "There's more? The device also contains my conversation with your ex-husband, David, where Harold Whitman paid him $5,000 to abandon you and publicly express doubts about your innocence. David was supposed to be their character witness, someone who would say you'd been acting suspicious and secretive before the scandal broke." Evelyn made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "David didn't leave because he believed I was guilty. He left because he was paid to leave. The recording device is voice-activated and has enough battery life to last for years. I've hidden it here because I know you visit my grave regularly, and because even Harold Whitman wouldn't think to look for evidence in a cemetery. Use this information wisely, my dear daughter. Make them pay for what they've done, but more importantly, clear your name and reclaim your life." The letter was signed, "With all my love and absolute faith in your innocence, Dad." Tom carefully examined the recording device, a sophisticated piece of equipment that looked like it had cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Your father was thorough," He was a principal for 37 years, Evelyn said, wiping tears from her eyes. He always said that the truth had a way of surfacing if you were patient enough to wait for it. They listened to portions of the recordings right there in the cemetery, using Tom's earphones to avoid being overheard. What they heard was devastating. Not just proof of Evelyn's innocence, but evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of Millbrook Falls. Government. Harold Whitman's voice was clear and unmistakable. The Grace woman is perfect for this. She's pregnant, emotional, has access to the fundraising account. When we're done with her, no one will ever think to look for the real money trail. Mayor Davidson responded, "You're sure she won't fight back? We can't afford to have this dragged. Out in court, she won't fight. Women like that don't fight, they just accept their fate and disappear. And if she does try to cause trouble, well, we have ways of discouraging that." Another recording revealed the scope of their theft. Over the past 5 years, they'd systematically stolen from school accounts, the volunteer fire department, the library fund, and various community organizations. The money had been funneled through a complex network of shell companies and eventually invested in real estate deals that made them millions. "We've been living like kings while kids in this county go without textbooks," Davidson's voice said. On the recording. But hell, Harold, that's just good business. The final recording was the most personal and painful for Evelyn to hear. It was the conversation with David, where Whitman laid out exactly what he wanted David to do. All you have to do is express doubts about your wife's behavior. Say she'd been acting strange, secretive about money. When the investigation concludes, you file for divorce. We'll make sure you get a clean break, no alimony, minimal child support. Think of it as a fresh start. David's voice was weak, uncertain. And if I don't, then you'll go down with her. We have ways of making it look like you were involved. In the theft, your choice, David. Take the money and start over, or lose everything defending a wife who's already lost. Evelyn removed the earphones, her face pale but resolute. I need to hear all of it, every word. They spent 2 hours in the cemetery, listening to evidence that would not only clear Evelyn's name, but send Harold Whitman and Mayor Davidson to prison for years. The recordings revealed corruption that had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from the community, destroyed innocent lives, and perverted the very institutions that were supposed to protect people like Evelyn. But as they prepared to leave, Tom's phone buzzed with an urgent text from Sarah. "Men came to the house looking for you. They said Evelyn missed an important appointment. I told them I didn't know where you were, but they're watching the house. Be careful." Tom looked at Evelyn, seeing his own grim understanding reflected in her eyes. Whitman's people had escalated their surveillance, and time was running out. They had the evidence they needed to destroy Whitman's empire, but only if they could survive long enough to make it public. "We need to get this recording to the authorities," Tom said, "but not locally. Harold Whitman's influence reaches too far in this county. What about your friend, the federal prosecutor, Agent Rachel Torres? She's in Springfield, about 3 hours from here. If we can get to her—" "If—" Evelyn's voice was steady, but Tom could see the fear in her eyes. "Evelyn, once we leave this cemetery with that recording, we become the biggest threat Harold Whitman has ever faced. He's already shown he's willing to destroy lives to protect his secrets. He won't hesitate to do worse if he thinks we're about to expose him." Evelyn looked down at Emma, who was still playing happily among the dandelions, unaware that her mother was about to make a decision that would determine the course of their lives. "My father spent his last months gathering this evidence because he believed the truth mattered more than safety," she said finally. "I won't dishonor his memory by running away now." Tom nodded, understanding that they'd crossed a point of no return. "Then we do this together. We take down Harold Whitman, expose the corruption, and make sure justice is served." As they left the cemetery, neither of them noticed the telephoto lens watching from the hill overlooking the graveyard, or the car that began following them as they drove toward what they hoped would be Evelyn's vindication and Harold Whitman's downfall. The drive to Springfield took on the urgency of a military operation. Tom had called ahead to Agent Rachel Torres, using coded language they'd developed during their army days to convey that he needed immediate assistance for a corruption case that couldn't wait for normal channels. Rachel had agreed to meet them at the federal building, but warned that they might have a narrow window before local political pressure could interfere. Evelyn sat in the passenger seat, the recording device clutched in her hands like a lifeline, while Emma slept peacefully in her car seat, oblivious to the magnitude of what her family was about to attempt. The weight of her father's final letter rested in Evelyn's purse, its words echoing in her mind. Make them pay for what they've done, but more importantly, clear your name and reclaim your life. Tom kept checking his mirrors, watching for signs of pursuit. Twice he'd spotted vehicles that seemed to be following them, forcing him to take detours through small towns and back roads that added an hour to their journey. By the time they reached the outskirts of Springfield, both of them were wound tight with tension and anticipation. "Tom," Evelyn said as they approached the federal building, "what if this doesn't work? What if Rachel can't help us, or if Whitman's influence reaches even this far?" "Then we find another way," Tom replied, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "Evelyn, your father spent months gathering this evidence. He believed it would be enough to bring them down, and I trust his judgment." Agent Rachel Torres met them in the building's parking garage, a precaution that spoke to her understanding of the situation's gravity. At 45, Rachel had the sharp professional bearing of someone who'd spent 2 decades prosecuting complex federal cases. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and her eyes held the kind of intelligence that missed nothing. "Tom Bradley," she said, embracing him briefly. "You look older, clean living." Tom replied with a weak smile. "Rachel, this is Evelyn Grace, the woman I told you about." Rachel studied Evelyn with the assessing gaze of a prosecutor who'd seen too many victims, and learned to distinguish between truth and performance. Whatever she saw in Evelyn's face seemed to satisfy her. "Let's go inside," she said. "I've arranged for a secure conference room where we can review your evidence without interruption." The federal building's security measures were reassuring. After weeks of feeling exposed and vulnerable, as they settled into the conference room, Rachel activated a device that would prevent electronic surveillance, then gestured for them to begin. Tom played the recordings in chronological order, watching. Rachel's expression grew progressively more serious as the scope of Whitman's conspiracy became clear. When David's voice emerged from the speakers, describing his payment for abandoning Evelyn, Rachel glanced at Evelyn with something approaching sympathy. "The recordings are clear and damning," Rachel said when they finished. "But I need to understand the full scope of this operation before I can move forward." "Tom, you said there were additional financial records?" Tom spread out the documentation Jerry had provided, along with his own investigative notes. "The digital evidence shows systematic manipulation of financial records going back at least 5 years. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from public institutions and community organizations. And the victims. Besides Evelyn, we've identified at least 3 other people who were blamed for financial irregularities that we now believe were covers for Whitman's thefts. A volunteer fire chief who was accused of mishandling fundraising money, a library board member who supposedly embezzled from the book acquisition fund, a youth sports coordinator who was blamed for missing registration fees. Rachel made notes as Tom talked, her prosecutorial mind already building the framework for a federal case. "What about witnesses? People willing to testify?" Jerry Hansen, the IT coordinator who discovered the planted evidence. Several school board members who were pressured to accept Whitman's findings without questioning them. And Tom hesitated, knowing this was the most dangerous part of their plan. "We think there are others in town who have information but have been too frightened to come forward." "Which brings us to the immediate problem," Rachel said. "If Harold Whitman realizes you have this evidence, he's going to do everything in his power to discredit it and eliminate the threats you represent. Federal protection can only go so far, especially in cases involving local political corruption. Evelyn spoke for the first time since they'd begun playing the recordings. Agent Torres, I've been living in fear for 3 years. I've watched my daughter grow up in the backseat of a car because these people destroyed my life to cover their crimes. I'm not asking for guarantees, I'm asking for justice. Rachel nodded slowly. The evidence you've brought me is sufficient to open a federal investigation. I can arrange for witness protection for all of you while we build the case, but she paused, choosing her words carefully. There's a faster way to resolve this, though it would require considerably more courage from all of you. What do you mean? Tom asked. We stage a confrontation. Get Whitman on record, admitting to the crimes, either through a controlled meeting or by forcing him to respond publicly to the evidence. If we can get him to incriminate himself with current statements that corroborate the old recordings, we have an airtight case. Tom felt his blood chill. You're talking about using Evelyn as bait. I'm talking about giving her the chance to confront her accusers with the truth. But yes, there would be significant personal risk involved. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly, where her unborn child was growing. Emma stirred in her sleep, making soft sounds that reminded all of them what was at stake. What kind of confrontation? Evelyn asked finally. A public forum, where the evidence can be presented and Whitman would be forced to respond. A town meeting perhaps, or a school board session, somewhere with witnesses and media coverage, where the truth can't be buried or ignored. Tom shook his head. Too dangerous. Whitman has too many allies in Millbrook Falls. He could control the narrative, discredit the evidence, maybe even have Evelyn arrested on some trumped-up charge. Not if we do it right, Rachel countered. Not if we have federal agents present, media coverage arranged in advance, and the full weight of evidence presented before he has a chance to respond. They spent the next 2 hours planning what Rachel called Operation Sunlight, a reference to Evelyn's father's belief that truth was like sunlight, painful at first, but ultimately liberating. The plan was audacious and risky, requiring perfect timing and considerable courage from everyone involved. Rachel would coordinate with the media to ensure coverage of a special town meeting called to address concerns about financial irregularities in local government. Federal agents would be positioned throughout the venue to ensure safety and prevent interference. Tom would present the evidence publicly for the first time, with Evelyn available to answer questions and confront her accusers face to face. The he, Rachel explained, is to make it impossible for Whitman to control the narrative. Once the evidence is public, once the recordings are played for the entire community, he won't be able to rely on intimidation and influence to bury the truth. As they prepared to leave Springfield, Evelyn pulled Rachel aside for a private conversation. Agent Torres, what happens to Emma and the baby if something goes wrong? If Whitman's people decide that eliminating me is worth the risk? Rachel's expression was honest and direct. I won't lie to you, Mrs. Grace. There are risks involved in what we're planning, but there are also risks in doing nothing. Men like Harold Whitman don't stop at destroying one life. They keep destroying lives until someone stops them. And you think I can stop him? I think you're the only person who can stop him, because you're the living proof of his crimes, and you're the one person he can't intimidate or buy off anymore. That evening, as they drove back toward Millbrook Falls, Tom and Evelyn began the most dangerous phase of their plan, returning to the scene of the crime to force a final confrontation with the people who had destroyed her life. Sarah was waiting when they arrived at Tom's house, her face pale with worry and determination. I've been talking to people all day, she reported, quietly spreading word that there's going to be an important town meeting about financial irregularities. I didn't mention Evelyn specifically, but people are curious. How many people are willing to attend? Tom asked. More than you might expect. It turns out a lot of folks have had doubts about various financial situations over the years. They may not have been willing to speak up individually, but the idea of a public forum where they can ask questions safely, that's different. Tom felt a surge of hope. His father had always said that communities were stronger than the people who tried to corrupt them, but that strength had to be activated by courage and leadership. Sarah, I need you to understand something. Once we call this meeting, once we go public with the evidence, there's no going back. Whitman will use every resource he has to destroy us. Sarah took his hand, her grip firm and steady. Tom, for 3 years I've watched this town pretend that Evelyn Grace didn't exist, that her suffering didn't matter. I'm tired of pretending. It's time for the truth. As they made final preparations for what would either be Evelyn's vindication or her final destruction, none of them noticed the surveillance equipment that had been planted in Tom's house during their absence, or the team of private investigators, who were already compiling dossiers on everyone who had agreed to attend the town meeting. Harold Whitman had spent 3 years believing that Evelyn Grace was broken and powerless. He was about to discover how dangerous a woman could be when she had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The Millbrook Falls Community Center had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. By 7 o'clock on Thursday evening, every seat was filled and people were standing along the walls. Word had spread through the town like wildfire. Something important was going to be revealed about financial irregularities in local government, and Sheriff Tom Bradley was going to present evidence that would shock the community. Harold Whitman sat in the front row, flanked by Mayor Davidson and 3 other members of the town council. His expression was carefully neutral, but Tom could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the arms of his chair. Whitman had tried to prevent the meeting through legal challenges and political pressure, but Rachel Torres had made it clear that federal interest in the proceedings gave them protection from local interference. Evelyn entered through the side door, carrying Emma and moving slowly due to her advanced pregnancy. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people recognized her, some with sympathy, others with confusion, a few with hostility. She took a seat in the second row, directly behind Harold Whitman, close enough that he could feel her presence like a weight on his shoulders. Tom stood at the podium, looking out at faces he'd known for most of his life. These were his neighbors, people he'd served and protected for over 2 decades. Tonight, he was asking them to confront an uncomfortable truth about their community and the people they'd trusted to lead them. 3 years ago, Tom began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. A respected teacher at our elementary school was accused of stealing money that had been raised to buy computers for children. Tonight, I'm here to present evidence that proves Evelyn Grace was innocent of those charges, and that the real criminals are sitting in this room. The murmur grew louder, more agitated. Harold Whitman shifted in his seat, but maintained his composure. Sheriff Bradley, Whitman called out, rising to his feet. I object to these proceedings. Mrs. Grace was thoroughly investigated by qualified professionals. The evidence against her was clear and convincing. Yes, it was, Tom replied. Remarkably clear. Almost suspiciously clear, you might say. Tom activated the room's sound system and played the first recording. Harold Whitman's voice discussing the plan to frame Evelyn. The effect was immediate and devastating. Whitman's face went pale as his own words filled the room. The Grace. Woman is perfect for this. She's pregnant, emotional, has access to the fundraising account. When we're done with her, no one will ever think to look for the real money trail. The room erupted. People were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding explanations. Several community members who had donated to the school fundraiser were visibly angry, realizing they'd been victims of theft disguised as justice. This is fabricated, Whitman shouted over the noise. These recordings are fake, created by someone with a grudge against me. Tom played the second recording, the conversation between Whitman and Mayor Davidson about their systematic theft from multiple community organizations. Davidson tried to leave, but federal agents positioned at the exits prevented his departure. Over the past 5 years, Tom continued when the room had quieted enough for him to be heard, Harold Whitman and his associates have stolen over $400,000 from this community. They've taken money from our schools, our fire department, our library, our children's sports programs. And when their crimes threatened to be discovered, they destroyed the life of an innocent woman to cover their tracks. Claire Morrison stood up from her seat near the back of the room. "Evelyn!" she called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't believe you. I should have fought for you." Other voices joined hers, people who had worked with Evelyn, parents whose children she had taught, community members who had benefited from her volunteer work. The tide of public opinion was turning, 3 years of suppressed doubts and uncomfortable questions finally finding voice. Harold Whitman made one final attempt to control the narrative. "Even if these recordings are genuine," he said, "they prove nothing about Mrs. Grace's guilt or innocence. She still had access to the money. She still could have taken it." Tom played the third recording, Harold Whitman's conversation with David Grace, arranging payment for David to abandon his wife and publicly doubt her innocence. When David's voice emerged from the speakers, admitting he'd been paid to betray Evelyn, a stunned silence fell over the room. Evelyn stood slowly, Emma in her arms, and faced the community that had abandoned her. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through 3 years of injustice. "I forgive you," she said simply, "all of you, because I understand how easy it is to believe lies when they're told by people you trust. But I want you to remember this moment. Remember how it feels to discover that the people you trusted were stealing from your children, your community, your future. And remember that it can happen again if you don't stay vigilant, if you don't ask hard questions when something doesn't feel right." Harold Whitman was finally arrested on federal charges as the meeting concluded, led away in handcuffs while the community he had betrayed watched in stunned silence. The man who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was revealed to be nothing more than a common criminal who had hidden behind respectability and influence. As federal agents secured the scene and began taking statements from witnesses, Evelyn found herself surrounded by people who wanted to apologize, to help, to somehow make amends for 3 years of turning away from her suffering. The vindication she had dreamed of was finally hers, but it felt different than she had expected, less triumphant, more bittersweet, colored by the knowledge of how much pain could have been prevented if just one person had been brave enough to ask questions when they first mattered. The hours following Harold Whitman's arrest moved with the swift efficiency of long-delayed justice finally being served. Federal agents seized boxes of financial records from Whitman's office, while forensic accountants began the complex process of tracing stolen funds through the network of shell companies and false investments he had created. Mayor Davidson, faced with irrefutable evidence of his participation in the conspiracy, broke down during his interrogation and provided a full confession that implicated 3 other town council members and revealed the scope of corruption that had infected Millbrook Falls' government for years. But for Evelyn, the most important developments were happening on a more personal level. As word of her vindication spread through the community, people began emerging from the shadows with stories of their own, doubts they had harbored, evidence they had noticed but dismissed, moments when they had chosen silence over uncomfortable questions. Martha Reynolds was among the first to seek Evelyn out, finding her the next morning at the cemetery where she had gone to place fresh flowers on her father's grave. "Evelyn, honey," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something I should have said 3 years ago." "What is it, Martha?" "The day before you were accused, Harold Whitman came to my store. He was asking questions about your shopping habits, when you came in, how you paid for things. At the time, I thought he was just being friendly, but now—" Martha wiped her eyes with a tissue. He was gathering information to use against you, wasn't he? Probably, Evelyn said gently, but Martha, you couldn't have known what he was planning. I could have warned you. I could have told someone that Harold Whitman was asking strange questions about you. Instead, I said nothing, and you suffered for my silence. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Linda Chen, the current school principal, accompanied by the entire school board. They approached with the formality of an official delegation, but their expressions were a mixture of shame and determination. Mrs. Grace, Linda began, the school board has voted unanimously to offer you immediate reinstatement to your teaching position, with full back pay for the 3 years you were wrongfully suspended. We also want to establish a scholarship fund in your father's name, funded by the money we recover from Harold Whitman's accounts. Evelyn looked down at Emma, who was contentedly picking dandelions from the cemetery grass, then back at the group of officials who had the power to restore what had been taken from her. What about the other teachers, the ones who believed the lies about me? They want to apologize, said Carol Peterson, the board's vice president. Most of them never believed you were guilty, but they were afraid to speak up. They're ashamed of their silence. And the parents, the community members who crossed the street to avoid me? Linda exchanged glances with the other board members. That's going to take time, Evelyn. People are dealing with guilt, with the realization that they abandoned an innocent woman. Some of them are angry at themselves, some are embarrassed, and some are still processing what really happened. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, considering the offer that would restore her professional life and financial security. 3 years ago, this was all she had wanted, the chance to clear her name and return to the classroom she loved. But now, looking at Emma and feeling the life growing inside her, she realized her priorities had shifted. I'll accept the reinstatement. And the back pay, she said finally. But I want to start slowly, part-time at first until after the baby is born. And I want to be involved in developing new financial oversight procedures for the district. What happened to me should never happen to anyone else. That afternoon, Evelyn received an unexpected visitor at the motel where Agent Torres had arranged temporary housing for her family's safety. David Grace stood in the doorway, looking older and more haggard than she remembered, his eyes filled with shame and regret. "Hello, Evelyn." "David?" Her voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "I heard about the arrests, about the evidence that proved you were innocent. I came to—" He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "I came to apologize for abandoning me when I needed you most, for taking money to betray me, or for letting me believe for 3 years that you thought I was a thief." David flinched at each accusation. "For all of it. Evelyn, I was scared. Harold Whitman convinced me that if I didn't cooperate, I'd be charged as an accomplice. He said you were going to prison either way, and that my only choice was whether to go down with you or save myself. So, you chose to save yourself. I chose to be a coward," David admitted, "and I've regretted it every single day since." Emma looked up from her toys at the sound of a familiar voice, but showed no recognition. 3 years was a lifetime in the memory of a small child, and the man who had been her father had become a stranger. "What do you want from me, David?" "Want to be part of Emma's life again. I want to help support both children. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but—" "You're right," Evelyn interrupted. "You don't deserve forgiveness. But Emma deserves to know her father, and this baby deserves financial support. So we'll work something out, through lawyers with proper legal agreements. But David," she looked at him with eyes that held no warmth, no trace of the love that had once been there. "We'll never be a family again. That chance died when you chose money over loyalty." As David left, Evelyn felt a strange sense of closure. The man she had loved and trusted was gone, had been gone for 3 years. What remained was simply a legal and financial obligation to ensure her children's welfare. That evening, Tom Bradley stopped by with news that brought a smile to Evelyn's face for the first time in days. "The town council held an emergency meeting," he reported. "They voted to offer you the keys to the house on Maple Street, your old house. The bank foreclosed on it after you lost your job, but the town bought it as part of a community development project. They want to deed it back to you, free and clear." Evelyn felt tears welling up in her eyes. The house on Maple Street, where she had planned to raise her children, where she had dreamed of a future that seemed impossible now, but was somehow being offered to her again. "Tom, why are you doing all this? Why did you risk everything to help me?" Tom thought of his father's badge, still carried in his pocket, and the lessons about protecting the heart of the community that had shaped his entire adult life. "Because," he said simply, "it was the right thing to do, and because someone needed to prove that Millbrook Falls still had people willing to fight for justice, even when it was difficult." As Evelyn prepared for sleep that night, Emma curled up beside her in the motel bed. She reflected on how completely her life had changed in just a few days. She was no longer homeless, no longer suspected of crimes she didn't commit, no longer alone in her fight for dignity and justice. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she rebuilt her life and prepared for the birth of her second child. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Evelyn Grace fell asleep feeling safe, vindicated, and genuinely hopeful about the future. 6 months later, Evelyn Grace stood in the doorway of her classroom at Millbrook Elementary, watching her 4th-grade students work quietly at their desks. The late spring sunlight streamed through windows that looked out onto the playground, where she had once brought her classes for outdoor lessons, back when the world made sense and justice seemed like something that happened naturally rather than something that had to be fought for. Michael Grace, named for her father, slept peacefully in a carrier beside her desk, 5 months old, and blissfully unaware of the extraordinary circumstances that had surrounded his entry into the world. Emma, now 3, attended the school's pre-K program and often stopped by her mother's classroom to share discoveries about crayons and alphabet blocks. The transition back to teaching had been easier than Evelyn had expected. Children, she had learned, were remarkably accepting of explanations like, "Mrs. Grace had to go away for a while, but she's back now and she's happy to see you." It was the adults who struggled more with the complex emotions of shame, guilt, and the desire to make amends for their silence during her years of suffering. Tom Bradley appeared in her doorway, as he did most afternoons when his patrol route brought him by the school. He had been promoted to county sheriff following Harold Whitman's conviction and the subsequent investigation that had revealed corruption reaching into the state level of government. The badge he wore now was his father's original one. Finally, restored to active duty. "How's it going?" he asked quietly, careful not to disturb the students. "Good," Evelyn replied, and meant it. Really good. They had developed an easy friendship over the months since her vindication, built on shared experience and mutual respect rather than the crisis that had first brought them together. Tom's family had become part of Evelyn's extended support network, with Sarah often helping with childcare and Tom serving as the kind of reliable friend that single mothers needed but rarely found. "Any word on the Harrison case?" Evelyn asked. Tom nodded grimly. The Harrison case was part of Evelyn's new mission, helping other people who had been falsely accused of financial crimes by Harold Whitman's network. Jenny Harrison, a volunteer, fire department treasurer in a neighboring county, had been blamed for missing fundraising money that federal investigators now believed had been stolen by associates of Whitman's operation. "The federal prosecutor thinks they have enough evidence to clear her," Tom reported. "Your testimony about Whitman's methods was crucial in establishing the pattern of false accusations." It had become Evelyn's calling, working with federal investigators and victims advocacy groups to identify and help other people who had been framed for financial crimes they didn't commit. The work was emotionally difficult, but deeply satisfying, giving meaning to her own suffering by preventing others from enduring similar injustice. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. As her students filed out, many of them stopped to say goodbye, their small faces bright with the unconscious happiness that came from being genuinely cared for by an adult who loved teaching. "Mrs. Grace," said Tommy Wilson, a serious 8-year-old who reminded her of her father, "my mom said you used to live in your car before you came back to teach us." "That's right, Tommy. She said some bad people told lies about you, but Sheriff Bradley helped prove you were telling the truth." "That's also right." Tommy considered this with the gravity that children brought to important matters. "I'm glad you came back. You're the best teacher I ever had." As the last student left, Evelyn reflected on how completely her understanding of community had changed. Before her fall from grace, she had believed that communities were naturally good, that people instinctively protected each other and sought justice for the innocent. The past 3 years had taught her that communities were more complex, capable of great cruelty through indifference, but also capable of profound redemption when individuals chose courage over comfort. Claire Morrison stopped by, as Evelyn was, packing up for the day. Their friendship had been slowly rebuilding, though it would never be quite the same as it had been before Claire's silence during the crisis. "Evelyn, I wanted to let you know that the school board approved your proposal for the financial literacy program." Evelyn smiled. The program would teach elementary students basic concepts about money, budgeting, and financial responsibility, but more importantly, it would include lessons about asking questions when something didn't seem right, and speaking up when they witnessed injustice. "That's wonderful. When do we start?" "Next fall. And Evelyn, the board wants you to lead the district-wide implementation. It would mean a promotion to curriculum coordinator with the flexibility to design your own schedule around Michael's needs." The offer represented more than just career advancement. It was recognition that Evelyn's experience, painful as it had been, had given her unique insights into how institutions could fail and how they could be improved. That evening, Evelyn sat on the front porch of her house on Maple Street, watching Emma play in the yard, while Michael dozed in her arms. The house had been completely renovated during her absence, transformed from the foreclosed property she had lost into something even more beautiful than it had been when she first lived there. David visited every other weekend now, as prescribed. By their custody agreement, he was trying to rebuild a relationship with Emma and establish one with Michael, but the trust that had once existed between him and Evelyn was gone forever. Still, she was glad that her children would know their father. Even if she could never forgive him for his betrayal, Tom's patrol car pulled into the driveway, and he emerged with a coffee for her and a juice box for Emma, a ritual that had developed over the months of their friendship. "Good day?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Very good. The financial literacy program was approved, and I got offered the curriculum coordinator position. That's fantastic. Your father would be proud." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Emma's elaborate game with her dolls while the sun set over Millbrook Falls. The town looked the same as it always had, but Evelyn knew it had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past year. People asked harder questions now, paid closer attention to their local government, and were more willing to speak up when something seemed wrong. "Tom," Evelyn said eventually, "do you think it was worth it? Everything we went through, everything we risked." Tom considered the question seriously. "I think about that sometimes. About what might have happened if I just looked the other way when I found you behind Fletcher's that first day. And I think my father was right. A badge doesn't make you a good man. It just gives you the chance to prove whether you already were one. But more than that, I think communities are only as strong as their willingness to protect the people who can't protect themselves." As darkness fell over Millbrook Falls, Evelyn Grace found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had lost everything: home, career, marriage, reputation, financial security, and had been forced to rebuild her entire life from nothing. But in the process, she had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed, had learned the difference between friends and acquaintances, and had found a purpose that gave meaning to her suffering. The teddy bear that Emma had carried through their darkest days now sat on the mantelpiece, a reminder of how far they had come. Beside it was a framed photo of Evelyn's father, his eyes holding the same quiet wisdom that had guided her through the worst moments of her life. As she prepared for bed that night, Evelyn read her father's letter one more time, focusing on the final paragraph. "Use this information wisely, my dear daughter. Make them pay for what they've done, but more importantly, clear your name and reclaim your life." She had done both. Harold Whitman was serving a 15-year federal sentence for corruption and fraud. Mayor Davidson and his co-conspirators had been convicted and sentenced to significant prison terms. The money stolen from the community had been recovered and returned to its rightful purposes. But more importantly, Evelyn had reclaimed not just her name, but her sense of purpose. She was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, but by what she had built from the ashes of her destruction. She was a teacher, a mother, an advocate for justice, and a living reminder that even the darkest nights eventually give way to dawn. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Michael's first word, Emma's transition to kindergarten, the ongoing work of helping other victims of false accusations find justice. But tonight, for the first time since her ordeal began, Evelyn Grace felt truly, completely, and peacefully at home in her own life. The truth, as her father had promised, had finally set her free.